Hello, and welcome to our webinar, Becoming a Shipper of Choice, Leveraging Technology to Overcome the Capacity Crunch. I'm Emily Atkins, your moderator today. I've been the editor of Inside Logistics magazine and its predecessor, MM&D magazine, since 2002. Joining me today are Dock 411 and C3 Solutions. C3 Solutions has been an industry leader in yard management and dock scheduling since 2000. It's dedicated to developing, implementing, and supporting the most complete yard management and dock scheduling solutions on the market today. C3's unique products allow customers to maximize the usage of their trailers, dock doors, dedicated yard staff, and physical yard space. Since its founding in 2000, C3 has gained the confidence of clients around the world and across many industries, including retail, grocery, distribution, manufacturing, and parcel post. Joining us today from C3 Solutions is Senior Vice President of Sales and Marketing, Greg Braun. Dock 411 is the leading supplier of facility information to the trucking, logistics, transportation, and insurance industries. The Dock 411 database tracks bathroom availability, wait times, parking, the best approach routes, and over 50 other attributes about tens of thousands of facilities across Canada, Mexico, and the United States. Truck drivers use the free app to research locations before they depart. Carrier operations use the data to assist and support their drivers from route planning through last mile approach to the facility. Shippers use Dock 411 to improve their shipper of choice position. By publishing current information about their facilities, shippers gain a competitive advantage in the market. If you're a shipper relying on for-hire carriers or an asset-light 3PL, you're no doubt aware that it has become more expensive and more difficult to get your goods delivered lately. This situation has been building for some time, but the shortage of trucking capacity this year in particular has been described as a perfect storm. In the spring, we read reports that there were about 10 loads available for every single truck on the road. And when retail giants like Walmart and Lowe's are having their loads rejected at a rate of 10,000 a week, you know there's a problem. At the root of this capacity crunch are a number of factors. First, the ongoing driver shortage, which estimates put at about 50,000 in the US alone in 2017. It's fueled by three major factors: an aging demographic of retiring drivers, the newly enforced electronic logging regulations that are cutting drivers' hours, and which some over-the-road carriers estimate has caused a 15 to 20% loss of capacity, and the lack of appeal of the driver's lifestyle to many potential younger drivers. In addition to the driver shortage, economic growth and the e-commerce boom are increasing the demand for trucking. Additional food safety regulations are requiring much more specific transport requirements that are harder to meet, and fewer carriers are capable of doing so. As well, traffic congestion in major centers also adds to the mix, slowing down already time-crunched drivers. This capacity shortage drives prices up, increases risk and uncertainty for shippers, and endangers contracts and customer relationships. Shippers are being forced to compete for carrier services. This may feel like business turned on its head, and for many it is a novel situation, but it's one that shippers need to understand and manage if they want to sustain and grow their bottom lines. Inability to move your product in a timely, cost-effective manner is a significant supply chain risk, and one that needs to be addressed by ensuring your company is doing everything to control the factors that are within its scope. The solution for many is to become what's known as a shipper of choice. This is the shipper that carriers choose to do business with, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So for our Q&A, my first question for Eric and Greg is, do you think the current capacity crisis is just part of the regular business cycle and that it will resolve itself? Greg, what do you think about that?
Well, Emily, I'm going to go on a limb here, and I actually don't believe it is cyclical. I think, as you mentioned in the intro, the current lack of drivers, it's much more demographic than an excess demand. And however, that being said, we do have an excess demand, and capacity is being limited by some of the new legislation like the ELDs. The ELD initiative is, most people put the estimates at around a 15% reduction in capacity right off the top. But I think, one of the biggest points is that millennials just don't find trucking an attractive career. Add to that as well that a lot of current drivers, because of these issues like the ELD, are actually getting out of the industry. So when you combine those 2 points, we've got a real capacity crunch. So I mean, I think ultimately the only way we're going to get out of this is transportation costs are just going to have to go up. I mean, ultimately we're going to need to be paying drivers more for the work they're doing today.
Interesting. And Eric, do you agree?
Yeah, Greg, you make some great points. I totally agree. If it is a cycle, this capacity crunch, we believe it's a very long one. It's not a matter of months or quarters, but we believe years before we'll see the other side of the cycle. And there's a lot going on. There's a lot of discussions. We're hearing now about a couple of organizations talking about shifting to hourly pay instead of per mile for drivers, looking for different ways to try to address some of the issues going on. And it goes beyond just the attracting drivers, but there's certainly that component to it for carriers and others trying to attract new drivers into the industry. But even that'll take 6 months, a year, probably a minimum, before there's enough information and experience with those, that one idea, for example, about whether it really pays off and is advantageous for everybody in the system, and then for other companies to adopt it and start implementing it. You're talking at least a couple of years. So while we believe it is cyclical, it's such a long cycle that we expect that we'll be in the current situation for at least a couple more years minimum.
Great, thanks, Eric. So given that we're in a long cycle and people are going to have to learn to ride it out, what does it mean to be a shipper of choice? Eric, can you tackle this one first for us?
We've heard the term, for over a couple years now, probably even goes beyond that. And like a lot of these terms, as it's been talked about more and more, people, while probably all originally people could agree on what they were talking about, as more people are involved and adding more to the discussion, it's become a little bit less clear that there's a single definition that everybody agrees on about what shipper of choice means. As we talk to different people, they have slightly different interpretations or so forth. But at its core, for us, what it means is that all else being equal, if you're a shipper and you've got a shipper in a facility next door to you, all else being equal, drivers and carriers will pick to work with you over your competitors or your neighbors or colleagues or so forth. It means doing the things that appeal to them and make them want to do business with you. So we try to really simplify it and get it down to something that people can get their arms around. And we hope that kind of a definition of the term, is something that people can readily understand and think about. Well, how are we doing versus our competition? So.
Okay, thank you. And Greg, what's your impression of what a shipper of choice means?
Well, Emily, I think to a large part, it comes down to common sense in a lot of ways. I mean, I think really for me, being a shipper of choice means you're going to be treating your carriers as essentially equal partners in your supply chain operation. And, more specifically, I mean, I think you just have to be a good corporate citizen. And how that translates, I believe, is like, you need to kind of keep them informed of what's going on, and if it's one of your standard carriers and so forth, you want to keep them abreast of any kind of new activity in the business, how that's going to convert into more volume for them or less volume. I mean, ultimately, just paying your bills on time, I think, is a big factor. I mean, when you see some of the surveys out there, that's what carriers expect. I mean, if they're going to have to be running after you to get paid, you're definitely going to go down on that list of the companies they want to continue doing business with. Now that's at the corporate side of things. I mean, I think when it gets at the ground level, it really, and what I mean by that is the drivers themselves. I think it converts a lot into just treating drivers with respect.
Right.
And right. and that is also fairly common sense types of things. I mean, I've been going through some of the driver forums you see out on Facebook and other areas, and drivers will post photos of signs that say things like, we don't want drivers in here. Drivers don't use the restrooms and stay away from this part. I mean, it's really almost offensive type things. Yeah. And, obviously when the driver, arrives at the business and he sees that he's actually he's treated as a second-class citizen, again, dispatch now is going to have a hard time getting drivers to be able to accept these types of loads. So ultimately it comes down to common sense, but, clearly you're going to have to systematize some of these things so that people just treat drivers with the respect that any of us would expect.
Yeah, Greg, I totally agree. We hear those kind of comments every day in the work that we do here at Doc 411. We hear from drivers. They're one of our key audiences, and we hear stories like that literally on a daily basis, even several times a day. Stories where a driver were told that they can't get out of their cab in a yard for hours at a time, 6 hours or more. There are things people need to get out and move. And, look, we understand there's security situations at different facilities and things, and we're not talking about those kind of facilities. It's just typical yards in some of these cases, or where they're not able to use a bathroom. They're told they're not able to use the bathroom is a very common refrain that we hear from drivers. So it is some of that basic human decency, if I can use that term, in terms of how drivers are treated at a lot of facilities. It is a problem. One of the things that we hear about, is that a lot of the shippers that we work with, they're so focused on doing their day-to-day operations, which we totally understand, that they really haven't had the time to actually look outside and see what's going outside and how they interact. They're focused on what's really going on inside the walls, so then taking the energy to think about what's going on outside the walls in the yard with the drivers, haven't spent quite as much time thinking about some of those. So it's, ultimately, I said, but a lot of shipper of choice for us is treating drivers, or all else being equal, drivers want to work with you. That's one way. Provide clean facilities. Be clear in your communication, and like any relationship, personal relationships that we all have, you need to listen, respond, and treat the others as you would want to be treated. So.
Okay, thank you. It sounds relatively simple, but what are some of the concerns that drivers and shippers are facing when they're talking about shipper of choice? Greg, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, as we said, I think, when we look at it from this regard, I mean, there's two aspects. There's, from the shipper's point of view, we mentioned some of the things that they're going to need to look at doing. And it ultimately comes down to, again, kind of common courtesy, paying your bills on time. Some of the other things too that's a major concern, and it comes down to, there's a bit of a capacity issue when it actually comes to trailer parking as well. So, I mean, if carriers can't actually park close to your facility and those types of things, that's going to be an issue. So, those are some of the things that shippers need to look at to make sure if they can't actually have carriers parking in their yard, then they need to be able to make sure that there is accessible parking close by. But I think when we're talking about drivers and what they're really looking for, when we're talking about being a shipper of choice, there's that courtesy aspect of things, but then there's also the turnaround, because most drivers, probably 95% of them, are being paid for driving. So if they're sitting at a distribution center, and let's say the consignee didn't respect their appointment, maybe they're not using appointments, and ultimately the driver's having to wait, that is probably one of the most major irritants for drivers, is they need to get turned around. They want to get back on the road. They want to get back earning. And that's one of the major concerns that we're seeing from drivers, is that we need to respect their time. Of course, the creature comforts are a big issue as well. but ultimately it comes down to turning them around as quickly as possible.
Okay, so Eric, what do you see from your user feedback?
Well, some of those issues we talked about before, have a bathroom, have a place for them to rest and relax, if it's at all possible. And again, we understand that's not possible at every location, but at least consider it and think about what you might do. And if you can't do anything, communicate that. One of the reasons that we started Doc 411 was my co-founder, Dan, was a warehouse manager, and he had drivers coming in on a regular basis every day, several times a day, saying that they had no idea what the environment was like there, where exactly it was beyond where Google Maps or another mapping tool could tell them. Any of the information about the facility, if there was a lumper fee, if there was parking in the area, if there were security concerns in the area, if there were special procedures that the driver needed to go through. Common problem of the address on the bill of lading is for the corporate billing office and nowhere near the dock or the yard. So, taking a step back, it's that there's a lot of information about the facilities that needs to be communicated clearly. So just as if any of us were going someplace, we would want to know, as much as possible before we left so that we could get in and out efficiently, like Greg was talking about. The wheels turning, if the wheels aren't turning, the drivers aren't making money, they want to get out of your facility in and out as quickly as possible as well, as you probably want them in and out. So one of the best things that you can do for them is to clearly communicate that information and use technology because there's a lot out there now to do it. Tell them about your facility, tell them about your special procedures, tell them the best way to get in, tell them who to contact, and so forth. One example, and then I'll turn it back to you, Emily. We had a driver tell us about a situation where they were told by their dispatch or operations that the facility that they were going to is open from 8 till 4. And so the driver made a decision that they had enough time to make a stop for whatever it was and then get to the facility at 3:45 and then be sure that they were at the facility before the 4 o'clock close time. So they did that and they got there at 3:45 and the yard manager said, "Oh, no, you're too late. We're open till 4, but we stopped taking deliveries at 3:30. And so that driver then had to wait, that was on a Friday afternoon, had to wait until Monday morning to be unloaded. So they literally sat in their cab all weekend. And, we hear about, obviously not a very fun situation, but we hear about those kind of stories on a regular basis. And really, I think ultimately what it boils down to, what we believe is there's not clear communication about this information. And it's, something that we're looking to change. So.
Thanks, Eric. It's clear that the consequences of not being a shipper of choice for the trucker are pretty painful, but what are the consequences for the shipper when they don't manage to do it? Eric?
I think ultimately it becomes down to supply and demand. There's a lot of demand. I think probably anyone listening understands that there is a lot of demand. And even people outside the industry know that. I was in an Uber a while ago, and that the driver was, they were not a professional truck driver, but they had been talking with friends and hearing about it and the opportunity because drivers are in the industry, the rates are significantly higher and there's some other opportunities. So my point is that there are people even outside the industry that are hearing about what's going on within transportation and logistics. And we've heard from other brokers that they are getting anywhere from 2 in some cases up to 10 times the dollar per load that they were 12, 18 months ago. Those higher numbers are on the more time sensitive type food type loads, but even twice. I mean, what industry could deal with a doubling of cost in such a short time frame without severe impact to their bottom line? One last point, and then I'll let Greg answer because I know he's got some good info on this. But recent thing story we saw that something like 40% of Fortune 500 companies mentioned shipping and transportation costs in their quarterly earnings calls. So, we think if 40% are mentioning it, it's probably a bigger number thinking about it. But that's a significant number of companies that are concerned about shipping costs. So doing something about shipper of choice is, very important and, significant impact on the bottom line for a lot of companies.
Thanks, Eric. And so, Greg, what do you see the consequences of not being a shipper choice?
Well, I mean, as Eric said, I think it's pretty simple. We're going to see, well, we're seeing transportation costs are going to go up. I mean, we've seen a lot of the publicly traded companies, a lot of companies have reported reduced earnings recently primarily due to the transportation costs. And I think it was Tyson that actually the CEO specifically named the driver shortage as the reason they missed their numbers. So I think this is going to be more and more common as we move forward. And it's simple. I mean, to make this occupation more attractive, you're going to have to pay drivers more, and that is going to result in higher costs. I mean, I was actually an interesting story. I was talking to a young professional the other day, and when he found out I was in the transportation business and industry, he mentioned, I was when I was going to university, actually, I took a year off to become a driver to earn some extra money, which I found very interesting. And he was probably, his profile was one of the last kind of persons I would have thought to be a driver. But he was attracted to it because he felt he could earn money, a lot of money. And but it's, I respected him for that, and I was kind of wondering, I kind of actually tried to figure out exactly what he thought of, whether he achieved that and so forth, of which he claimed he did. But I mean, that's the kind of thing that's going to have to happen for millennials and all kinds of folks, just to decide that, hey, we need to get back in, this is a viable occupation for us. And because there's the costs are going to go up. There's also a safety factor as well that's involved. I mean, if we're not going to be able to be turning drivers around fast enough, and there's excess waiting and so forth, there's that risk of fatigue that's going to increase. We see that in some of the regional markets we're involved in particular in Australia. There's very strict legislation that's in place there that makes everyone, it's called the chain of responsibility. It makes all actors involved in a shipping transaction responsible for potential accidents. So that in that case, then, the shippers are very, very conscious of the fact that, hey, I cannot afford to delay a driver here. If I delay him, that risk of fatigue goes up. If he gets into an accident, God forbid, that's going to be potentially coming back on them. So again, that's another point where, we've got to seriously respect that, drivers and their time and as we mentioned earlier as well, just treat them better as human beings, but probably more importantly, we're going to just have to be able to turn them around a lot quicker.
Thanks, Greg. So with the failure being so costly, if a shipper only had the means to pursue one or two initiatives towards becoming a shipper of choice, what would you recommend, Greg?
Well, I mean, I think the first point, and this is kind of, what I would regard as low-hanging fruit, is you need to make sure if you don't have a good culture in terms of how you treat drivers today, you need to change that quickly. And again, that's kind of common sense. We just need to treat drivers better overall. You need to make sure they have access to restrooms and the common things, and you don't treat them like second-class citizens. So that's I would like to think that that's going to be pretty straightforward, pretty simple thing to do. On the other end of things, and there was an interesting article in the Journal of Commerce a couple of weeks ago, and the title of it was to the effect that it's actually shippers that are in a better position to influence the capacity issue because of some of the points we've discussed and wasting drivers' times and so forth. This particular article referred to the fact that there's probably about 20% of capacity which is being wasted right now. Yeah. So, and ultimately it comes down to better scheduling. I mean, can you make sure that you're able to maximize the utilization of that driver's time? And that's going to require some effort. That's going to make sure that you actually think about how your receiving processes work in the case of inbound, you'd be able to make, offer appointments or do a drop and hook program where you can get drivers in and out as quickly as possible. And so that's going to maybe require some technology. It's definitely going to require you to kind of reevaluate your current processes just to make sure that, when drivers do arrive, are we able to kind of receive them properly? And again, as we've, repeated here many different times, turn them around as quickly as possible. So I think, from my perspective, if I had two points, obviously the first one being, the low-hanging fruit, treat them better, treat drivers generally better. But secondly, you're going to probably need to invest in technology and put some thought into how you can actually make your facility much more efficient in terms of turning drivers around.
Great, thanks, Greg. And Eric, do you agree, or do you see other options?
Yeah, I pick right up where Greg left off in terms of using some technology. But when we're talking with shippers, of course they're looking for a quick fix, or maybe that's not quite the right word, because it maybe suggests that they just want to do something and not think about it, and that's not the case. I don't mean to suggest that. They're looking for something that they can do now because their costs are going up now. While there's things that maybe they've even been thinking about, but they involve a larger capital expenditure, or maybe something that they hadn't anticipated or planned for 2 to 5 years. This problem is here today, as we've been talking about, and I'm sure they're experiencing. So, there are technology solutions for a lot of this. Even from the low-hanging fruit, as Greg talked about, and obviously some of these bigger efforts are primarily technology. But some of the simple things are to, again, start putting the information about your facility out there. Talking with drivers and understanding, and actually listening, put in a feedback system so that drivers can tell you what is going on. And that technology could be as simple as just paper, or talking to somebody, talking to drivers. What could we do better here? Maybe it's a trip to a big box store to get some more paper towels in the bathroom. We've seen that literally. It might be something as simple as that. And the question is, well, we hear is, well, that's just helping that one driver. The drivers come. What we encourage shippers to do is then turn that around and talk with your carriers and the drivers and tell them, look, we understand. We're hearing about this. We're making an effort. Again, going back to the whole relationship discussion, a lot of it is just showing that you're making an effort to improve the relationship. You're aware of some of these problems, and you're doing some things. So, but again, there are some technology out there that allows you to publish this information, collect feedback. There are technologies to help with scheduling, things that become aware of actually how much time drivers are spending in your facility. But a lot of it, again, for us is start by talking to the drivers, the carriers, find out what their issues are, what they like and don't like about your facility, and then turn around and tell them, look, we are trying. We understand about shipper of choice. We're taking steps to improve that, both short term and longer term. So, and we've seen that the companies that we're working with are reporting success with that approach. So
I agree, Eric. I mean, it's this problem's not going away, and I think you raised a great point. Get that kind of a feedback loop going, so that at least drivers know that you're doing something about it. Some of these initiatives are more longer term, but hey, at least if they know you're committed and you're focused on kind of finding a solution, I think that in itself is going to go a long way as well.
Yeah. Well, and I think it helps focus and make sure that those longer term initiatives are the right ones. We've seen companies that were spending time on stuff that ultimately, we questioned whether there was, and they did question whether there was going to be any benefit, or the benefit that they were hoping for. I don't want to over emphasize the relationship, but it does. My business mentors have always told me a lot of business is about relationships. So by showing the drivers and showing the carriers you care, they'll they'll come in and look, they understand things happen, and it's not that everything's going to be perfect, but by having the open ears and listening and understanding, it just makes the whole operation run more smoothly, and we are confident it will help with shipper of choice efforts.
All right. Thank you, Greg and Eric. That concludes the questions that I had for you. And just to wrap it up, I would say that being a shipper of choice is clearly key to maintaining good carrier relationships and using that as a means to ensure that you have access to the trucking resources you need when you need them. It doesn't sound as though it's that difficult. You've talked about common sense, and the takeaways that I'm hearing for our listeners are: treat your drivers and suppliers with respect. And secondly, use technology to your advantage by scheduling and keeping dock appointments. Leverage the data you gain from sources like Dock 411 to ensure that you've got the best possible facilities for drivers and their trucks. If you use these tools to become a shipper of choice, you've got a leg up on the competition. It's your secret weapon to surviving the capacity crunch. And that's it. That wraps up our webinar with C3 Solutions and Dock 411. Thanks to Greg Braun and Eric Weidl for your time today.
Welcome.
You're welcome. Thank you, Emily. Thanks, Eric.
Thanks, Greg. Talk to you later.
You bet.